From the MCA DSV offices in Jefferson City, this is Public Affairs Director Matthew Huffman, and this is Momentum, a webcast produced by your coalition connecting advocates across the state. In this episode, I am talking with two of the folks on our prevention team, Nora Mosby and Nicole Crespi. So, Nora, Nicole, welcome.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So, it's February, and February is Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. And I thought since the three of us all work on the prevention team, it would be a good opportunity for us to really talk about teen dating violence. What are some of the dynamics? What are some prevention efforts happening around the U.S., here in Missouri? And then I also thought we could kind of speak to our younger selves at the end of the episode, too. But just to kind of get us started, when we're thinking about teen dating violence, I wanted us to really kind of talk about what are some of the dynamics there. Because teen dating violence does look different than adults who experience intimate partner violence, sexual violence. So let's really kind of dig into those differences. What do y'all think about that?
Well, for some of us, our teenage years were many years ago. And in a lot of ways, the world has changed. And the world is different than it was when I was a teenager. And so for me, I think it's really important to think about how teens' access to technology and access to information in general is just so much more advanced than it was for me as a teenager.
Yeah.
And so I think teens are using technology so much more and using technology in ways to create relationships and using it for social interactions that they weren't before, which I think in some ways is very, very beneficial, of course, to teens, but also opens teens up to some increased risks for dating violence and violence in general as well.
Yeah, I think for me it's actually that violence in any relationship, like now that I can see it from a zoomed out advocate perspective, I'm like, it's all the same, isn't it? It doesn't matter how old we are. It doesn't matter really what access to technology we have in terms of having more information or less, because even though teens have all this access to the whole internet and amazing resources, there's also the same kind of mist that we were like passing secrets about in the halls are online. So they're really not necessarily getting better information through their access to the internet. They're just maybe getting quicker information.
Mm-hmm.
They can Google things a little bit more and find a wrong answer within a couple of seconds, rather than waiting all day to like see their friend in their last hour class or something and ask them the question and get the wrong information.
Yeah.
And I think the other part of that is like the experiences that teens have are the experiences that adults are having, but maybe just with way less understanding of what that means, way less understanding of who they can talk to about it, where they can get services, because they just haven't been exposed to that information yet.
Yeah.
I like that point you bring up, too, about how a lot of the same dynamics that exist in all abusive relationships are very similar for teens. And I think we could look at a power and control wheel, for example, and look at all the different tactics of abuse that are described there and identify those in teen dating violence relationships as well, but also look at maybe how they are kind of more exacerbated because of the situations that teens find themselves in, because they don't have the same access to resources or the same kind of mobility than an adult would have.
Yeah.
But they might also experience issues of self-blame or shame so much more intensely just because of their age or their lack of experience or lack of, resources or experience isolation so much more severely or just differently. So a lot of those dynamics, I think, or those abuse tactics are similar for teens, but maybe more severe because of their age and what they can and can't do related to their age.
Well, and I think both of you bring up a really good point there, too, about age and experience. And so for a lot of teens, if your first dating experience, you end up experiencing any form of abuse, whether that's emotional or psychological, or it does get physical or sexual, it can be your first time experiencing any of those. And so without context, yeah, that level of severity for you, it does feel so much worse because you don't know what else you might experience. And if it's your first time in a relationship, it almost becomes normalized.
Yeah.
So it's this terrible feeling of, I'm just dating and this is so exciting, but actually I've had a really bad experience in dating, and is this what it's always supposed to be like? And if you try and talk to your friends about that and they had a similar one, you experience more self-blame, like you were saying, Nora. So there are just so many ways that for youth, it can be a really confusing time.
And I think that's why it's so important to recognize teen dating violence and to respond to it, because it is such an opportunity to stop that kind of relationship from becoming normalized.
Yeah.
And so not only just, I think, looking at the relationship and preventing a relationship from happening, but also looking at the behaviors that maybe are unhealthy or potentially abusive, and recognizing them for being potentially a red flag or a warning sign of an abusive relationship. So I think some teens might feel extremely flattered if somebody is wanting to be with them all the time or texting them 25 times an hour, but maybe talking about how that behavior can be concerning. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an abusive relationship, but that it can be concerning. And I think one thing that's very different for teens is that, well, maybe it's not different for teens, but I think teens listen to so much to each other and their peers. And so there's great opportunities for change to happen when it's peers sharing information with each other. And so really there's an opportunity to raise awareness about teen dating violence amongst teens, so that they can support each other when they see some of these behaviors that could indicate an abusive relationship.
Yeah, I think that's where I see it mirroring adult relationships so much, is that we know that survivors of violence turn to the people they trust, which are their friends and their family first. And that is across any age range. So it's really kind of unfortunately up to us, up to like the lay people of the world, to be prepared to handle these issues. And I have a hard time placing all of that responsibility on the teens themselves.
Yeah.
So, like, yes, adults, let's get it together. Let's do our research and take care of each other. And, of course, encouraging that for youth, too. But, like, they're going through so much. They're learning so much. They have more limited information, especially on these kind of taboo topics. Especially when we talk to teens about them, it gets uncomfortable. So how do we balance supporting them so that they know the information and are prepared to support each other, but that all of that responsibility doesn't fall on them to take care of each other, because these issues are so much bigger than them.
Yeah.
It's like we all have a role to play in responding and supporting teens, whether you're an adult in the community or somebody who works at the school or somebody who works at the place that they hang out at, or if you're another teen, or maybe even a younger kid. Parents. Yeah. So there's a lot of different, I think, levels and opportunities to support teens.
Yeah, maybe that's the lesson. Is it's we can encourage everybody, all those categories of people, to be a part of this, and that way the responsibility is sort of spread out.
Yeah.
It's not all in one area.
And some teens will feel more comfortable confiding in their peers, and some will want a trusted adult.
Yeah.
And so a comprehensive approach will meet the most need.
Yeah. Well, and I think that we've seen that be successful in many other areas. When you have a comprehensive approach to something, whether it is prevention or response, it is much more effective and sustainable than if one person or one agency or one group of people decide, we will do everything, we'll cover everything. So it really is just recognizing and honoring we all have a role to play, and how do we support each other in that.
And I think it's about recognizing that teens are going to be different, and one person is going to have different needs from another person, and not every person has a trusted adult in their life, or it is safe to talk to their parent. And so creating other options so that they do have a safe person to talk to that they're comfortable confiding in.
Yeah. I want to stick on that for just a moment, thinking about how important it is for young people to have that safe and trusted adult in their life, because not all youth have a stable home life or parents who are actively involved and sometimes they do, but it might not just be an easy way to identify who that trusted adult in their life is. So I wanted to talk a bit about just if teens are experiencing any kind of dating violence, what services exist and how do they access services? Because I know that that's something that many member programs kind of struggle with. I know it's something that many middle and high schools struggle with. So how do we help our youth experiencing dating violence?
And I think especially given our changing times and the increased use of technology that teens have access to, and so many teens are communicating with each other and so much more comfortable communicating using text or using email, or probably not email, but apps, whatever. That having support that is available, not maybe on a helpline or in a way that somebody has to pick up a phone and actually talk to somebody, but what are ways that maybe a teen would be more comfortable accessing services if it's through a text line or some kind of other web-based application.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the hardest things. Like, I was a teen like 6 or 7 years ago, and I think one of our, like, the biggest thing that was on my mind was like, just don't get in trouble. Just whatever. We're just in any situation. In school, just try not to get in trouble. Just like at work, try not to get in trouble. In relationships with friends, like just trying, like you just want things to go smoothly. And at least in my experience, it was like the last thing we want is for adults to get involved.
Yeah.
Because somehow somebody's getting in trouble. At that point, like somebody's going down, detention, something's happening. Like, and I think it's that sense of powerlessness that you can feel as a young person, who you're not in control of where you go or what you do or who you talk to, unless you have really, I don't know, chillaxed parents, or you are maybe possibly doing a little bit of sneaking around. Right? That's when you're free, is when you're maybe not where you said you were going to be, or maybe with people who you know that the adults in your life don't trust, or whatever. Like, so it can be so much harder to get the help you need if those enjoyable free times go wrong.
Yeah.
If you end up experiencing harm or witnessing it or learning that that's happening to a friend, it seems like, you know, the most effective thing would be to get an adult who's in control of the situation and has access to resources, but that's also maybe the hardest person to reach out to.
Yeah.
Because there could be negative consequences from that too. Yeah. That's not a solution. It's just a barrier that I'm like, wow.
Yeah. But an important one to acknowledge, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that is a very specific reality for a lot of youth who might experience some sort of dating violence is, well, I don't want to get them in trouble. So maybe they downplay that level of abuse they experience, or maybe they really don't reach out to that trusted adult. So that's such an important dynamic to really consider.
I was also thinking about our member program, specifically domestic and sexual violence service providers. And I'm happy to be here with you all who are on the prevention team to talk about this, because when I think about our program's contact with teens, I think the greatest amount of contact that they're having is often in schools when they're going in to provide prevention education around issues of domestic and sexual violence. And that might be the greatest contact, and for a lot of communities, maybe the only contact that teens are having with domestic and sexual service providers. And so to have that awareness as prevention educators, that could be an opportunity to connect students with services and actually making those connections happen while you're providing prevention education is really important, because of course our goal is to prevent anything abusive or violent from happening in these teens' lives, but we have to recognize that violence is very likely already happening.
Yeah.
And so what can we do as service providers to make sure that not only are we preventing it, but we're also responding to it and connecting survivors who are in those classrooms with support.
And that's such a great point, Nora, because, you know, we can look at national surveys and data that we see coming out from CDC, a few other national places, that will give reports that before the age of 18, upwards of 60% of teenagers will experience some form of dating violence. So here in Missouri, whenever member agencies are going out and working with youth and giving youth and community presentations, you know, the disclaimer that I think often we give to adults in the room is we want to acknowledge that there might be survivors in the room, and what we're talking about could be triggering, so certainly take care of yourself. But for many youth, that could be the very same thing. They've already experienced some form of dating violence or sexual violence, and it can be triggering for them, and that could be their one point of, wow, I realize this happened to me. Here's someone I really need to talk to about it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, what an amazing opportunity to be that trusted, caring adult. So that's one of our protective factors for teens who could potentially experience dating violence, is that they have a connection to a caring adult. And we can assume that's parents, but like I said, they were caring adults, but I didn't want to get in trouble. So,
Yeah.
you know, parents hold a lot of power over their kids. And so just that dynamic of you're in control of my life can make it hard to open up and be vulnerable with someone. But an advocate coming in, bringing up issues that are normally taboo, talking about them in a non-judgmental and open way, and knowing that that person has come into my school specifically to talk about this issue, they must be kind of informed on it and know, so I don't have to just ask a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they're bringing it up and that they're from outside of the school means that they can't actually give me a detention.
Yeah.
So maybe I can, like, their level of power over me is a little bit less. So maybe I do feel a little bit more comfortable bringing up questions that I wouldn't normally ask, or that I think might get me in trouble, something like that.
Yeah. So not to add more work on the prevention educators, but in a way I think it's really important for prevention educators to represent, or at least be relevant to the students that they are providing information to. And so as much as possible, if they can come from a similar community, or use inclusive language in terms of gender identities, or even be racially diverse and their racial background, I think is really important in terms of making those connections happen too.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we know the messenger matters, and we know that representation matters. So really being able to connect with youth where they are and using those little indicators and signals to let youth know that you are that safe and trusted adult. And so, using a gender inclusive language, just trying to be really open and inclusive in your conversations can make a huge difference, and is certainly something that youth will pick up on and remember.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a bit about some of the underlying conditions that end up leading to dating violence. And they're the same underlying conditions that we know lead to domestic and sexual violence when we start talking about it in adults as well. So just kind of continuing that conversation about the similarities but differences between dating violence and domestic violence. So the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, they started a project a couple of years ago called Prevention Through Liberation. And really what they're trying to do with that project is find a balance between striving to really give young people an understanding of what is dating violence, what is consent, what is a healthy relationship, but then also engaging youth and engaging marginalized communities to really focus on, how do we put into practice holistic and comprehensive measures that address these underlying issues of things like racism and sexism and homophobia. And that is a difficult thing to balance, right? We want youth to feel equipped with their knowledge and skills, but we also don't want to put too much pressure on them to say, okay, also now go out and change society as well. So really thinking about how they find that balance. And something that the Oregon Coalition has done is they try and work on prevention through liberation by asking 2 questions. First, what causes sexual and domestic violence? And so we kind of touched on it, but it is something that I think we in the field commonly understand, which is domestic and sexual violence are based in that power imbalance. But then we also know that it does stem from those root causes of sexism, racism, homophobia. And then that's their second question, which is, how do we address these structural systems of power that lead to that inequality? So what are your thoughts on that? How do we find that balance between giving youth skills and knowledge, and then also how do we address the sexism, racism, homophobia that exists as well?
Well, so my first thought is that I really appreciate how they are framing anti-oppression work with the language of liberation.
Yeah.
Because I think when we think about anti-oppression work, it can seem so overwhelming, so daunting. These are huge social issues. But if we're framing it in this positive, hopeful language of liberation, what we're doing seems much more manageable if we're able to look at each kind of little incremental step that we can take that increases a person's freedom or increases equality. It seems much more feasible, I think, if we use this language of liberation. So I appreciate that they're using that language.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because that was a big question. And I thought, how are we going to solve oppression?
How are we going to do that?
At this table? But it really is. It's in those like small things that are focused on what makes you feel better, what makes the situation better. And it is a lot of pressure to put on kids, on teenagers, on youth, however we want to categorize them, people who are just now learning about the world and they're growing their brains and their bodies and they're very busy. And so how are we going to put all this weight on them? But I think because they're going through that process, and Nora keeps bringing up like technology is changing, their experience as teenagers is different than all of ours at this table.
Yeah.
And so they do know what about that experience hurts them and what about it helps them. So I think their brains, even though they're in process and they're growing and they're changing and all of this, are the ones that hold the information that we need as the professionals to make the change. So we have to rely on them to give us the information about what really matters to them, like you said, making it relevant. And our job then is to challenge them if they come up with things that we realize are gonna play into oppression, that are gonna hurt someone who maybe they're not thinking about at the moment. But then also to support them when they come up with a great idea. Like, yes, whatever you've come up with, how can we as adults find the resources that you need to make it happen?
Yeah.
And I think kind of another issue, not to make matters even more complicated, but thanks a lot to the third wave feminist movement and these kind of intersectional theories, we know that youth and teens and all survivors are not experiencing oppression in one form, but also many, many forms.
Yeah.
And so youth are not just experiencing, sexist oppression or racist oppression or homophobia, but maybe all of these things all at once. And so then it becomes even more overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so I like it when you brought up these issues of addressing risk and protective factors for violence. Because if we can break it down in ways that are looking at how do we not maybe address this issue of oppression that is intersectional and complex, but look at these risk and protective factors. If we address, say, for example, a risk factor that is like a safe environment to live in, or what are some other risk factors?
Yeah, let's see. Cultural norms that support aggression is
Yeah.
a risk factor.
So if we can kind of identify what risk and protective factors are, and a lot of these are research, well, they are research based and evidence proven, then we can, by addressing these risk and protective factors directly, we are actually preventing violence and reducing the impact that oppression has on the life of youth.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's like we can focus on things that might seem outside of our scope, or like, that's not why I'm here though. But okay, one of our risk factors at a societal level, it's a risk factor for teen dating violence. It's harmful norms around masculinity and femininity. So we know that there's a huge conversation about gender and identity and expression going on. That's a risk factor for the topic we have today because it's Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, but also for a ton of other types of violence that our youth might experience, including general youth violence, bullying, suicide, sexual violence, and child maltreatment. So just by looking at one thing that might affect students that could come from them saying, hey, I'm dealing with this doesn't work for me, and we might say, okay, that's an issue we need to address, but right now we're focused on a different one. No, like, we as adults have to see how they're right. It's all interconnected, and by listening to their experiences and addressing what they're saying, we can have an effect on all these other types of violence that maybe we weren't even thinking about.
And that's such a good point about connecting the dots between multiple forms of violence, because it is very likely that an individual teen could be experiencing multiple forms of violence, and that risk factor can go across all of them. So whenever we really look at developing comprehensive prevention approaches, it does need to come through that intersectional lens. And Nicole, to your point about kind of giving voice to youth and lifting up their experiences, if youth are saying, this is what I'm dealing with on a daily basis, maybe I'm in front of the classroom to talk about dating violence, but that's not the topic they're identifying. Well, then it's on us as those trusted adults to really look at how do these things connect and how do I give them the resources they need right now instead of saying, oh, well, that's not really the focus though. So it's so important that we not shut down that lived experience as the adult in the room who has access to like the research and the evidence-based programming.
Yeah, right. We're the experts because we've had more time and maybe we've done more reading and taken more classes, but they're the experts on what they're experiencing right now. And that's the whole reason we're there.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
And jumping back, Nora, I agree with you. I do really like the language that the Oregon Coalition uses for this project, prevention through liberation. And it just reframes it with such a positive outlook, right? That we are liberating youth to have a violence-free future.
Yeah.
And it gives a very positive and hopeful way of framing it. So you're not talking about all of those heavy topics of red flags and what dating violence is, but giving youth the opportunity to dream about what does a liberated future look like.
Yeah. I always think about liberation as really expanding options, making life bigger, just kind of, making it more of something.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a great way to approach anti-oppression work and anti-violence work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Nicole, I also want to jump back just for a minute to some of the stuff that you were talking about in terms of centering our prevention efforts on marginalized youth and really lifting up youth voices. So as you were kind of talking about that, my mind went to, if we aren't helping provide these resources to youth, they will find them on their own, which could end up being really bad misinformation. Or they might start trying to create it for themselves. And so the example that I often think of is the My Gender Unicorn that was created by trans youth because they didn't see information that reflected their own lived experience. So they had to create it for themselves. And one, I think that that's great and empowering that they did it. But I think it also highlights the fact that we need to be giving youth the information they need so they aren't always having to create things for themselves. How can we be helping them through this?
Yeah, I like that too, because not only are we asking youth what they are experiencing, but then asking what would make it better.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we focus on asking about what are the issues that you're facing, which is very important because we need to know and we need to listen and be prepared to support, especially teens who are going through this. But asking what makes it better, what makes sense to you, is the information that we're giving, is that working for you? Actually, that's not a good question because they'll just say yes because they don't want to get in trouble. But
You're right, yeah.
So really being intentional about how we're communicating and what opportunities we're giving. Are we giving them opportunities to just say that we're doing a good job? Or are we giving them opportunities to say, this is what I want and need? And are we supporting them in that creation? So like the gender unicorn is now used all over the place.
Yeah.
And truly, I've only heard Matthew ever give credit to the fact that it was students who created that. And so once students do create something that is effective, how are we supporting them, giving them that credit, citing their work? Are we putting it in textbooks? Are we putting it in curriculum? And I think not only does that help us get really effective information that's relevant to the students because they created it themselves, but it also gives us a body of work that we can take forward.
Yeah.
And that like things are changing, like we keep saying, and we don't have to guess and hope that we're right, but we can base it off of facts because it's the lived experience of these students.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really a balance, I think, between providing information and resources with supporting grassroots efforts to fight oppression or fight violence.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult balance, but I think it also shows us the both and, that we can address both of these, and when we do, it complements and creates a more comprehensive way for us to really work with youth to ask them, what does liberation look like? What does it look like for you to never have to experience this? And it actually, as both of you were talking, it made me, who is admittedly a public health nerd, reframe the way that I think about evidence-based. So if youth are telling us what they are experiencing and what they need, then that is the evidence for us working with them to lift their voices and create the resources and give them the resources that they need.
Yes. And that evidence is not going to come in numbers and charts, which is hard for us, I think, as adults to like take that in as, is this real information? Or is this just like, is a comment from a student evidence? But it is, right? As our programs, member programs and advocates are going out and interacting with their communities, particularly in schools, you have a perfect, little sample of youth experience and what they say, the feedback that they give you when they're asking questions or making comments, or on evaluations. If you have pre and post tests, that is the data that tells you what they're looking for the next one. So the evaluation piece is really important too. Like, how are we gathering information, not only from the adults who access our services that are more well-known, like shelter, but also our prevention services and just those community conversations.
Yeah. Well, and that's so important, thinking about evaluation and assessment, because it is something that we absolutely have to value and hold on to when we're trying to make any sort of community level change, when we're trying to do any sort of community-centered prevention, is actually taking that information in and using that as our evidence of, now here's how we can work together as a full community to really boost those protective factors and create better and safer environments.
I was kind of thinking about, no matter how much we as not teens think we know, teens know so much more than we could ever know. And like, my mind, of course, goes to technology because maybe that's what my insecurity is around, or where, just the first thing I think of. But there's so many things going on in teens' lives. Like we could also spend a long time talking about the media and what kind of forms of media or entertainment teens are using, or even access to drugs and alcohol, and like what is that looking like for teens. So there's just so many different areas that I have no clue about, and that we really do have to get that information and let teens identify what their priorities are and base our prevention work and services on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So check yourself before you wreck yourself, adults.
Do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those assumptions can be
That's right.
a problem.
Yeah.
It's the easiest way to lose credibility in front of a room full of youth.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and I think it's not only like bringing back in the intersectionality theory and the fact that we need to be responsive to all teens. Like when we do ask them, what social media sites do you use? Or when we do go into classrooms and talk about these issues to raise awareness, or maybe we get the opportunity to do sexual health education or healthy relationships, which schools do we get into? Which students are getting these surveys and getting these conversations? Is it in after-school programs that are like paid? Like, are they the adventure club where people have to stay after and the parents pay and it's a whole arrangement? Are they at nonprofit organizations that offer those same services for free? Because we know that the students who go to each of those different programs have very different experiences based on race and socioeconomic status, etc. So are we getting all of our information from teens who look and experience the same kind of things? Or are we being intentional about who we ask to?
Because true liberation isn't just for people who can access that or who are privileged. True liberation would meet everyone's needs for liberation.
Yeah, and that's such a great point to really keep in mind too. Yeah. So at the end of our episodes, I like to ask kind of a fun question and have us kind of go around and give an answer. So for this one, I was thinking if we could go around and think about, knowing what we know now as adults who have been entrenched in this work, what advice would we give to our teenage self? Yeah. So I had a little bit of time to think about it, and as I was, working on our outline for this episode, like, what would I tell myself? And really what I kept coming back to is, like, as a young queer kid who grew up in the South, I never saw anyone else who openly identified as LGBTQ. And so kind of going back to what we talked about a moment ago of how important representation is, I would go back and tell myself, just be really proud and happy of who you are, because as long as you are happy with yourself and proud of yourself, it's going to make everything else that seems like a big deal so much easier.
Yeah.
But yeah, for all the young queer kids out there, especially young queer kids in the South, I sympathize with y'all, and it is rough. But, like, finding that support system of your other queer friends, your trusted adults, and then just being happy and comfortable in who you are, it makes such a big difference.
For sure.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's a great one. I think that's like
really good.
Standard amazing advice is like try to be happy with who you are, because that's really what's most important. My advice, again, going back to, I don't know, maybe I was just a very fearful child. I wanted to be great at everything, and I really didn't want adults to be mad at me or to get in trouble. And so one of the things that I avoided doing was asking adults a lot of questions. And I had access to adults who had the information that I needed. My own dad is a nurse, and so I could have asked him. He worked with a ton of nurses. My mom was a social worker. So I had access to people who were studying teens and relationships and all this. I could have asked any time. I went to the doctor, and I even would write a list out of the questions I wanted to ask my doctor. And then when we got there, I would never ask. Because what if they said that I shouldn't be talking about that or thinking about that? It's like all these questions, a lot of questions that teens have seem like you're a little too big for your britches there. Like, calm down. You don't need to be talking about this information yet. And so there's a fear around asking, at least for me. And so my advice would be ask adults questions. Just ask them, because even if they say that thing, you're just getting one perspective. And don't stop asking. Like, once you ask one adult, ask every other adult the same question, because that's how you learn, right? Like, they might not have the answer that's right for you, but somebody might. Or you might learn that everybody gets to make up their own answers, and so you might give yourself permission to do that too. So ask the questions, even if it's really awkward.
Those are really good ones.
That's good advice too. I like it.
Mine are pretty practical and basic. My first thought was, Nora, your teenage self, you should start saving money because you would be so rich by now. You know? And then my second one was, try tomatoes because they are delicious after all. But yeah, maybe just try things that you don't think you like. They're good. And save money, of course. It's practical.
No, those are really practical tips. And just to tie it around and have it be full circle, we know that one of the things in the Stop SV technical package is providing opportunities for women and girls to have economic empowerment and financial independence. So there you go, Nora. Telling your teenage self.
Yeah, exactly.
CDC evidence-based there.
That's right. Well, thank y'all for coming on today and talking with me about this topic. I think it's really important that we recognize it and talk about it in February, but also year-round. So thanks for being on here today.
Absolutely.
Thanks.